what the U.S. should, I think, continue to uphold is the notion that we stand for the peaceful resolution of these kinds of conflicts through international adjudication, and that we are opposed to the use of coercion or military force to resolve them.
More of that conversation is coming up in just a moment. This is Asia News Weekly, a podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. For the past year, I've been discussing the South China Sea. This past week, both Obama and China confirmed what I had to say. Plus, Facebook comes to the rescue, and South Korea mourns the passing of the Sewol ferry victims. These stories and more are coming up next on the April 17th edition of Asia News Weekly. Hello everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Asia News Weekly. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and it is my pleasure to have you here with me this week. Now, for the past 2 years, I've actually been discussing what's been taking place in the South China Sea. We've talked about the 9-dash line, the expansive AZID China employs, the competing claims by ASEAN members, land reclamation, China bullying other countries, and the potential for Beijing to militarize the reefs it's building upon. Now, could things ultimately come to a head? China announced last week what it intended to do with the land it was reclaiming in the South China Sea. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying said, "We are building shelters, aid for navigation, shelters and rescue, as well as marine meteorological forecasting services, fishery services, and other administrative services for China and neighboring countries." Hua also noted that the islands would be used for China's defense. This is exactly what I've been saying since day one. China is moving in, unchecked, developing strategic bases of operation. I've maintained that ASEAN nations are too weak and too disorganized to do anything to prevent China from doing this, and that since the United States and Japan haven't stepped up their roles, China has effectively won the territory. Speaking last week, U.S. President Barack Obama said that Washington is concerned China is using its sheer size and muscle to push aside smaller nations with claims to areas in the South China Sea. We think that this can be solved diplomatically, but just because the Philippines or Vietnam are not as large as China doesn't mean that they can just be elbowed aside, he said. Really? That certainly hasn't been demonstrated in the past, but could there actually be a diplomatic solution still available? Scott Harold, political scientist and deputy director for the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation.
Well, I think quite clearly there is an option. It's going to require all sides to agree that moving this problem out of the realm of coercion and into the realm of diplomacy and potentially international adjudication is the way to go. And right now, we've seen, unfortunately, Chinese side move towards attempting to further consolidate its claims through the use of construction, through the use of paramilitary forces, through the use of fishing vessels, and potentially even through the use of gray-hulled military vessels. And so right now I think the real question is the only power that really is unwilling to move this in a direction where it could be resolved peacefully appears to be China. They have not used force, but they have used what in many analysts' opinion amounts to coercion. And I think that the real question now is whether or not we can find a way to get China to agree to submit its claims to an impartial international panel of jurists that would decide such things. The Philippines has moved in that direction. Vietnam has at times talked about being willing to do that, although it has not yet done so. Malaysia has not really gotten as involved, but the time may come when all of the claimant states need to think about using that. And I think that the view of many of the observers of this issue is that time is definitely better sooner rather than later.
Well, let me get your opinion on this. Given that China isn't budging, typically the United States makes it known that it doesn't take a position on territorial disputes. If China doesn't move forward with some sort of diplomatic option, could we reach a point where the United States would have to make a decision on where it lies on these territorial disputes?
I certainly don't think so. I haven't heard anyone say that they think that the United States should be picking which rock, which reef, which islet, which submerged oceanic feature belongs to which country. I think that the U.S. analytic community and policy community is probably still likely to remain of the mind that the best position for the United States to adhere to is to say we're really focused on process, not on specific outcomes. Because at the end of the day, if the various parties to the dispute were to decide, let's say the Philippines was to decide, okay, we've talked with Vietnam and we agree that what we had thought was ours, but we've now agreed is now Vietnamese is Vietnamese, and the Chinese have also agreed to that. We wouldn't want to be in a position of saying, no, but we said it was yours, the Philippines. What the U.S. should, I think, continue to uphold is the notion that we stand for the peaceful resolution of these kinds of conflicts through international adjudication, and that we are opposed to the use of coercion or military force to resolve them. But at the end of the day, if states begin to try to change facts on the ground by building new ground, or facts on the water by building capabilities that allow them to coerce their neighbors, we could make clear that we're not going to recognize any change in status, but it should be said there has not been any change in status, and that would be a very big Rubicon for any state in the region to cross, that being taking its neighbor's territory by force. Of course, the Chinese essentially changed the status they essentially took disputed territory away from the Philippines in 2013. Back in 1995, they took Mischief Reef from the Philippines. In 1988 and in 1974, they took disputed territories from Vietnam. So it has happened in the past, but not in a big way and not in an unambiguous way where they've booted physically occupied rocks, where they've taken those away from someone yet. So that would be the next big step, and then that would potentially require a rethink on the U.S. side.
All right, Scott Harold with the Rand Corporation, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely, Steve. Take care.
Now, I've said it before, and I shall say it again. This is the region to keep an eye on. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. What are we going to see in the coming months in the South China Sea? Please leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. And coming up later in the podcast, believe it or not, Facebook came to the rescue. This week marks the one-year anniversary of the sinking of the South Korean ferry Sewol. The ferry was en route from Incheon to Jeju Island when it capsized due to being overloaded and illegal modifications made to the vessel. In total, 304 passengers perished, most of whom were students from Danwon High School. To say the ferry sinking not only caught the nation off guard, but wounded it deeply would be an understatement. Even a year later, many are still saddened by the events. Joining me now via Skype is Lee Tae-hoon, publisher and managing editor of the Korea Observer. Tae-hoon, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. Now, a year has passed, and in that time since the Sewol sunk, President Park Geun-hye made several promises to get to the bottom, the root causes of what led to this disaster, and hold those accountable. Has she delivered on those promises?
Yes, to a certain extent, but not really to me. She promised many things. She promised to make people who are accountable punished, and gonna make a lot of regulatory changes and structural changes in the government. And on top of that, she promised an independent special investigation to find out what exactly happened. And also, she promised to meet the family members whenever they want. Bottom line is, she is not meeting the family members who want to see her and get the message across for an investigation that they want.
Right, and even this past weekend there was that clash as family members and other protesters tried to go to the Blue House, which kind of leads me to this next question. How do the families feel the government is handling everything that's transpired this past year?
The families are feeling that the government is doing exactly everything against their will. The families believe the government is working very hard to stop the investigation, appoint people who will make sure that no fair investigation will be done. Because there have been some people, like a captain, who has been taken accountable. The shipping company has taken some rules and they've been punished. But the question is, what are the rules that the high-ranking officials, all those people who are involved in the case, and why the investigation? Why the rescue didn't happen promptly enough to rescue them? And family members want to find it out, but the government is, I think, doing their best to stop it.
Yeah, and it's really sad. There was the whole issue of the stalemate in Parliament last year, just trying to get the initial investigation bill passed. Immediately following the sinking, there was a national period of mourning, festivals were canceled, and people generally stayed indoors. And even recently, some of the shrines to those who lost their lives in this terrible tragedy resurfaced after being taken down for a period of months. Now, a year later, how are South Koreans marking this anniversary date?
A lot of people are visiting Gwanghwamun Square, where the victims' families are, and they are paying tribute. And a lot of people are remembering it in a way that it's a time for Korea to change. It's a time to disclose the dirt and bring about change. And I think there is a great movement in Korea, the grassroots movement. Unfortunately, in the government level and the big media level, it's not happening. I think they are trying to divert people's attention. Like, for instance, today marks the first year's anniversary. So where's president? I think she's going to leave the country very soon. Okay, and also what you are hearing about the Sewol ferry sinking recently, it was about 1.2 billion dollars of money to raise the ship. People are the media and the government are trying very hard, make sure that people are concerned about the cost, about the victims in raising the ship. They are not really concerned about finding the investigation. So there is a grassroots movement, individuals who do not trust the media and the government, doing their part to find out the truth and to support the victim's family.
Now, you bring up another good piece of information, getting to the bottom, finding the truth. And you also mentioned Park Geun-hye leaving South Korea on Thursday to do her South American and Middle East tour. And this is amidst of a real high-ranking bribery scandal that's hit 8 top-level officials in the Saenuri Party, including both former chiefs of staff, the current chief of staff, and the current prime minister. What's the latest on this controversy?
Today, the opposition leader, Moon Jae-in, threatened impeachment against Prime Minister Lee Won-gu unless he resigns. Unfortunately, Lee Won-gu is involved in is allegedly one of the 8 high-level politicians who took bribes from that construction CEO. Lee insists that he has nothing to do with it, and he will kill himself if it's gonna be later found that he took the bribes, and he's not gonna step down soon. But I think there is a great chance that the impeachment will move forward.
All right. Lee Tae-hoon is the publisher and managing editor of the Korea Observer. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you, Steve.
Coming up later in the podcast, additional stories from the region you may have missed. There is perhaps no greater time suck on this planet than Facebook. By some estimates, people spend as many as 40 minutes every day on Facebook, or up to 7 hours a month, posting pictures, checking status updates, and playing games. I tell you what, I absolutely hate it. I loathe it. Sit me down with a fresh brewed cup of coffee and a good conversation any day over staring at a screen to see what my friends are up to. I'd rather just talk to them. But that doesn't mean there isn't a time or a place for Facebook. In fact, if I hadn't have joined Facebook when I first moved to South Korea, my mother would have had no idea what I was up to. In fact, I had my own website, but it wasn't until I started posting blog posts and videos on Facebook she actually had an inkling of what I was doing on a day-to-day basis. It can also be used for good. Last week, Facebook was used to rescue a Filipino maid from Bahrain. Abby Luna said she was raped and beaten by her employer's son. She managed to post a video to Facebook, and shortly thereafter, that video received 78,000 shares and 19,000 likes. The Philippine embassy then found out about it on Thursday. She said, quote, "Help me get out of here. I'm scared. Until now, my genitals hurt. My leg is bruised. He," meaning the attacker, "punched my leg to immobilize me." Luna said that after the employer's son had abused her, he threatened to kill her and bury Luna in the desert if she told anyone about what had happened. Luna's alleged attacker denies any wrongdoing in this matter. Luna also alleges that her employer didn't believe her claims of being raped and beaten, insisting that she complete the entire term of her employment contract. She also alleges that the employer told her to get an abortion if she ever became pregnant. Thankfully, the embassy and her employment agency were able to extricate her from this terrible situation. But unfortunately, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Last year, another Filipino maid was rescued from Saudi Arabia under nearly the same circumstances. Which then begs the question, how do people find themselves in these situations? Here's Phil Robertson with Human Rights Watch.
Well, there's a lot of duping often connected to job offers and employment. This reflects the fact that in many countries in the region, there's difficulty in finding good, decent work that provides adequate remuneration for people. There are many more youth seeking jobs than there are those good jobs, especially youth without a high-level education. So people who are have limits in terms of the sort of work that they may be able to do or may be able to get. And so the promises of good job, particularly connected to migration, that, if you go to another country, you can get a better job and send money back, that takes people away from networks of relatives and community. It makes them more vulnerable. They may not know the language. They may not have any way to outreach to people in case they get into trouble or being exploited. So the duping connected to migration is a major problem. I'll give you an example of the trafficking of men onto Thai fishing boats. Oftentimes, these schemes are only as complicated as they need to be to deliver someone into that exploitation. So cases of men in Cambodia, poor farmers, are offered jobs working in factories or in plantations or, for instance, farms, raising animals, are encouraged by the brokers to go to Thailand, to cross the border, to take up a job, often with a fairly lucrative offer compared to what they're earning in Cambodia. But instead of being taken to that land-based employment, they're taken to a fishing pier, they're controlled by a gang, and they're forced onto a fishing boat.
That is only a small portion of our conversation. You'll be able to hear the entire discussion tomorrow on Asia Now. It's now time to take a look at some other stories from the region. First up, Japan and South Korea held their first security talks in 5 years. The talks were held Tuesday of this week and referred to as the 2+2 talks, involving senior foreign ministry and defense officials. This is despite tense relations between each of the respective governments. South Korea is monitoring any possible change in defense guidelines between Japan and the United States, as well as how it acts upon the newly reinterpreted right to collective self-defense. Another sticking point between the two nations was whether or not Japan would send troops to fight on the peninsula in support of the United States should North Korea attack. As it has said numerous times, Tokyo would respect the sovereignty of South Korea and only provide troops and support if Seoul requested it. Japan was the butt of many jokes when it tried to assert its whaling program was scientific. Most around the world saw it for what it really was, a thinly veiled attempt to hunt. The International Whaling Committee rebuffed Japan's latest attempt to resume the program. The report stated, "With the information presented in the proposal, the panel was not able to determine whether lethal sampling is necessary to achieve the two major objectives. Therefore, the current proposal does not demonstrate the need for lethal sampling to achieve those objectives." Japan had been selling the whale meat from the slaughter of animals in the so-called study. Earlier this year, South Korea's Constitutional Court threw out a 62-year-old law criminalizing adultery. Much of the world focused on the headline that this made adultery legal in South Korea, and in some ways that was actually true, despite civil penalties for the act still left in play. Now the court is set to rule on another sex issue, that of prostitution. Sex workers staged a protest last weekend demanding the court make their jobs legal. Kim Kang-ja, a former police chief in Seoul, testified on behalf of the women working in the sex trade. While she declared war on underage sex dens, she said adults should be able to do their jobs without fear of being punished. Not everyone agrees in South Korea, and the ruling could challenge the conservative nation if prostitution becomes legal once more. Pu Ren, also known as Jin Yaoji, passed away this past Friday. He was the youngest brother of Pu Yi, the last Qing emperor of China, who was 96. The film The Last Emperor depicts Pu Yi's life, and if you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. It's a tale all too familiar with those following events in Tibet, someone self-immolating. In this case, last week a nun committed the horrific act, calling for a return of the Dalai Lama. Yeshi Kondo is believed to have died, but that hasn't been confirmed since authorities took her body away after extinguishing the flames. She was said to be in her 40s and was from the Nangang Nunnery. Yeshi Kondo is the second woman to have self-immolated this year, and overall the 138th person to do so since 2009. Officials in the region view the act as terrorism. And that is just a sampling of other stories taking place in the Asia-Pacific region. Well, my friends, we are here once more again at the end of the podcast, and it's my turn to share some of your excellent comments from this previous week. So here we go. First up, again, Red White Dude. Article 44 is an excuse to extend martial law, its military rule, with a new wrapping. The noob said on our Bitcoin Asia Now podcast, Bitcoins give hackers a new purpose for malware. They are able to infect PCs with malware. Malware has many uses like botnets for DDoS attacks and such, but these can also plant a Bitcoin miner on a PC. They use up the computer's resources so they can mine for Bitcoins. Normally, this would take a long time, Bitcoin mining. But if you have like 100 PCs infected, you could cut down mining time a lot. And of course, they would get the Bitcoins and not the PC owners that they exploit using malware. To that, Medicine Bottle 1 replied, "There is so much computing power in the Bitcoin network that controlling 100 or 1,000, quote, infected PCs would never win you any significant amount of Bitcoin. As the computing power of the network increases or decreases, the difficulty of winning the next block reward of 25 Bitcoins also adjusts, so that each block is found every 10 minutes on average. When Bitcoin began in 2009, the block rewards were issued every 10 minutes, and today it's exactly the same because the network adjusts the difficulty. At Kema on Twitter said, Malaysia was never about real democracy. That's why Singapore was kicked out. Javier Morales said, South Korea is facing serious problems regarding the abuse of power from chaebols and politicians. The whole educational system and strong Confucianism roots into society is making the life of professional women hell. I never came across such judgmental and misogyny corporate culture in my entire life. Again, thank you so much for your comments. I truly do appreciate them, and I hope you'll take a moment this week to leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Be sure to keep up with more news from the region by following Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your questions, your comments, and your feedback. Our email address is podcast@asianewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed this week's Asia News Weekly podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. It's absolutely free and easy to do. Just go to our website, asianewsweekly.net, and click the subscribe tab, or you can do so in your favorite podcast application like iTunes or Stitcher. Well, my friends, that is all the time this week. My name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.